This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Es kam die Zeit, da man sich nur dann mit Stolz zum Deutschen bekennen durfte. Immer und immer wieder predige ich, der Wiederaufstieg der deutschen Nation ist die Frage der Wiedergewinnung der inneren Kraft und Gesundheit des deutschen Volkes.
Nazis. I hate these guys.
I will not go down in history as the greatest mass murderer since Adolf Hitler.
Springtime for Hitler and Germany. Deutschland is happy and gay.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about Nazis. Specifically, we're going to be starting a new series on the history of National Socialism, and in it, we're going to answer some of the big questions about the topic. How on earth did Hitler go from being an itinerant painter to the master of Europe? How did the Nazis destroy German democracy and build one of the most powerful political regimes in history? Why did the Nazis have such contempt for human life, killing millions of Jews, but also other people, including Roma or Gypsies? How did they convince the nation of poets and thinkers, as Germans are often referred to, how did they convince them to embrace these type of destructive and violent ideas? Finally, how German is the story of the rise of Nazism? Could some government someday get you to shoot your neighbor? Could it get you to stand idly by, or even worse, to clap at the killing of something like a baby? Nazism, in many ways, one could argue, brought out the worst in humanity. Could it happen again? These are some of the deep issues that we'll be discussing over the course of the next couple episodes as we work through this difficult but important history. Now, to set the stage for our conversation today, I played a little mashup, similar to what we did for our Queen Elizabeth episode. The song you heard in the background was probably familiar to some of you. That was the Deutschlandlied, or sometimes it's translated as the Song of the Germans, the Song of Germany, something like that. And today, the Deutschlandlied is Germany's national anthem. However, the words that you heard were probably a bit unfamiliar. And this is because basically what I played for you was the first stanza of the song, which is rarely played these days because it talks about a Germany that stretched, quote, from the Meuse to the Neman, from the Adige to the Little Belt. Germany, Germany, above everything in the world." End quote. Now, the song itself was actually written by August Heinrich Hoffmann und Fallersleben in 1841. It's quite a mouthful, obviously. And when Fallersleben wrote the song, there was no political definition of where Germany was. It was more of an aspirational ideal. It is more of an abstract idea of something that we're working towards. And so when Fallersleben thought about where is Germany, he thought about it in linguistic terms. He thought wherever there are people speaking German, they must be included in part of this idea of the German community rather than in a sort of formal political country, if you will. Now, after World War I, the Deutschlandlied became the anthem of the Weimar Republic. And then, of course, Hitler took this idea of a greater Germany and made it into more than just a kind of abstract ideal, but he tried to make it into a living political reality. Hitler launched wars, invaded countries, right, trying to make, in some ways, this Germany discussed by the song into a reality. Now, after the war was over, obviously there was some reaction to this, and West German authorities decided we're only going to sing the third stanza. This one talks about things like unity and justice and freedom. And so it's much more appropriate for a democratic state, right? It's much more easy to disassociate it from the legacy of National Socialism. Now, in order to make it more interesting, at intervals in the song, I added some excerpts from speeches by Hitler, along with quotes from Indiana Jones and then Dr. Strangelove. And I did this to indicate the attitude that a lot of people living in modern American society, modern European society, even other parts of the globe, things that we might include in quote-unquote Western society, this is the way that a lot of us felt, especially in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Right? We don't want to be associated with Hitler. We don't like the Nazis. They're evil. Finally, the little mashup concluded with the start of the song Springtime for Hitler from Mel Brooks's 1967 comedy, The Producers. If you haven't seen this movie or the play, the show is basically about con men, and they want to design a musical that's going to fail. And so what better way to make a musical that'll be a complete flop than making something that celebrates the idea of Hitler and the Nazi Party and their kind of takeover over Europe. Now, to add to the fun, Mel Brooks is a very famous comedian, for those of you who aren't familiar with the name. To add to the fun, basically these producers hired this flamboyantly gay transvestite to direct it. They then cast in the lead role of Hitler this kind of hippie guy. And so the whole thing is supposed to be kind of a joke, and it's basically, not to give the whole story away, but it kind of backfires on them, right? And so it's a comedy, ha ha ha. But I ended the mashup with this particular clip because it relates directly to the subject of today's episode, which is going to discuss the relevance of Nazi history for the present day. Because to be honest with you, for a lot of people out there, the history of Nazi Germany no longer seems relevant. Some people are even trying to rehabilitate Hitler. And we'll talk about this more in a moment, and we'll also explore why this type of thinking is problematic, perhaps even conspiratorial. But for them, for these people engaged in this kind of historical revisionism, it has indeed become springtime for Hitler. And so in our episode today, we basically want to focus on this question of, does the history of Nazi Germany matter? The answer, of course, is yes. But we're also going to talk about why that is. Now, before we get there, just two quick programming notes for you. First, as I just laid out, there is obviously an incredible amount of history to cover when you're talking about something like National Socialism. So rather than doing just one incredibly long podcast on the subject, I'm actually going to break this into what will be approximately 12 episodes that will cover the most important aspects of Nazi history. We'll talk about things like the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, about what led to World War II, and how and why the Nazis implemented the Holocaust. But at the same time, I also recognize that some of you may want a little bit more. You want to go beyond the basic storylines and understand Nazi society in a deeper and more fundamental way. And so for you, I have two suggestions, or two things that I'm kind of preparing for you. One, I'm going to start putting a recommended reading list on my website for German history. So if you're interested in particular subjects, you can find out more about them. You'll see what some of the latest scholarly opinions are on it. And then I'll include Amazon links to that so you can go right to Amazon and order them if you so desire. So all of that will be on my website, which is www.historyoffthepage.com. Second, for those of you that prefer audio formats, I'm going to produce a number of special episodes on specific topics related to Nazism that will be available to my Patreon subscribers. These will include episodes on topics such as the history of Auschwitz, on Nazi ideals of gender, or on things like the occult and National Socialism. What's the relationship? What are the origins of that? And our first Patreon-only episode will be about the young Hitler. It'll basically talk about Hitler before World War I, during World War I, and get you up to the point where he basically joined the Nazi Party. So if you're interested in finding out more, go to Patreon or, again, check out the website. I'm not sure what the order will be of posting some of these special episodes, so the best thing to do is just to check on the website or on Patreon itself. Okay, having said all that, I'm actually going to spend most of the podcast today doing something a little bit different than talking about the history of Nazi Germany. Because before we can start talking about that history, we need to talk about why it matters so much. Because to put it bluntly, people today are forgetting that history. People today, in some cases, are trying to reimagine that history, to tell a story where Adolf Hitler was a good guy, and the real villain of World War II is Winston Churchill. There are people today that are saying we need to move past the Nazi past, that the Holocaust is not just this tragic event that really we need to keep in mind and never again, and it needs to motivate us to be better human beings and more vigilant about the dangers of the modern world and the way that human beings can treat each other. There are people, as we'll see today, that say, no, it's time to move on. That's old news. We don't have to worry about that. Let's get excited about AI and God knows what else. We are seeing a surge today in Holocaust denial. Social media and podcasting have very few barriers in terms of production. Right? I want to record a podcast. I just sit here in this room. I record the podcast. I release the podcast. I pay, $12 a month or something like that for the ability to post it online for a hosting site. There's almost no barrier or no gateway to make sure that the information being presented is valid anymore. And so in this environment, Holocaust denial, Holocaust relativization, this is flourishing. Now, for many of you, the idea that Nazi history is irrelevant or Nazi history is being forgotten or is being reworked, that may surprise you a little bit. Some of you might be thinking, well, yes, there are some people out there that are kind of crazy. There are some people that are neo-fascists, neo-Nazis. Of course, Stormfront.com has been there for at least 20, 30 years at this point. Yeah, there are neo-Nazis out there, but they're such a small sliver. It's such a minor thing. Everybody knows that the Nazis are bad. Everybody knows that this history matters. After all, as the little mashup that I just gave you shows, whether people live inside the United States or outside the United States, the Nazis have long been the subject of a tremendous amount of historical attention. If you go to your local bookstore, for example, if they have a German history section, the German history section is almost always just about Hitler. If you want to publish a book on the subject, and it's any way possibly related to Nazism, you have to title it Hitler's such and such. And that's the publisher's decision, because Hitler is such a key word that people look for when they start searching for things. We, of course, have large cultural institutions, like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. We have Yad Vashem in Israel. And these institutions are dedicated to raising awareness of what took place so that it never happens again. We have endowments and foundations all over the world that are dedicated to supporting Holocaust education. We teach about this in many schools and through cultural productions like Schindler's List and Boy in the Striped Pajamas. How many of you growing up had to read that book or watch that movie? So the notion that the Nazis are historically important or relevant is so ingrained in us today that it seeped into broad aspects of popular culture. Who is it that Indiana Jones hates the most? It's the Nazis. Who was Captain America's first key enemy? The Nazis. Why did Eric Lensherr become Magneto if you're an X-Men fan? It's because he was tortured by the Nazis. Now, you could go on and on with these types of cultural references, but the point here is that Hitler and the Nazis are such a powerful cultural reference that fictional films use them all the time to embody or personify evil. I don't have to explain to you very much why the Nazis are bad in Indiana Jones. You just know they're Nazis. They're obviously evil. They don't care about human life. This power of Nazi symbolism in contemporary Western society is not accidental. One could argue that it's the product of 70 plus years of Americans and other Europeans, and indeed people around the globe. It's not just a kind of quote-unquote Western culture. But for decades, people have used Nazism as this kind of foil, as a negative role model that tells us what we don't want to be. To kind of go into a little bit more detail about this, of course, how do we learn our values? Yes, our parents teach us. Yes, if you're religious, right, you read the Bible or you talk to your priest or your rabbi or your imam or whoever. But we also learn a lot by the cultural values that we have and the stories that we tell. And of course, we love to tell stories about heroes. People in the United States like Abraham Lincoln or Michael Jordan or Martin Luther King Jr. But we also tell these kind of negative stories. We also have personifications of the things that we don't want to be. Right? If you have kids or if you watch a kids movie, the villains get to be villains because they often are greedy, they're power hungry, they're egotistical, right? They demonstrate qualities that we do want to discourage in society. So for us, for many, many years, Nazism was again the antithesis of the American way, or the Western way, if you want to put it. Incidentally, it was also the antithesis of the Eastern way. Right? If you're growing up under communism, Hitler is also the ultimate foil. To kind of flush this argument out just a little bit more, if we as Americans believe in the idea of democracy, in a world in which ordinary people have some kind of influence over the politics of things happening around them, then the Nazis are the exact opposite. A group of people who celebrated the idea that everyone should submit to the will of the leader or the Führer. If we believe in individuality and the freedom to be different, then the Nazis believed in social conformity and sacrificing your desires and interests for the good of the collective nation. We believe in social equality and the freedom to rise or fall based on our own merits. The Nazis believed in racial hierarchies and the idea that biology was destiny, that your future was predetermined by your racial characteristics. We believe, or we at least want to believe, that peace is the desired state of humankind. The Nazis felt that the desired state of humankind was war, and they glorified the extreme use of violence and used it as a tool to solve perceived social problems. So again, in many ways, Nazism, the memory of it, the way that we talked about it, the way that we displayed it in movies, in books, in history classes, its importance was obvious because it told us what we did not want to be or did not want to become or allow. For many years, of course, this was all seen as obvious, and this was true across the ideological and political spectrums. Doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, left-wing, right-wing, right? There was general consensus about the meaning of Nazism. And this was especially true if you are, like me, a young Gen Xer, or if you're someone older, or even some of the millennials out there, you understood this intuitively. No one had to come to you and say, well, this is why it's important to talk about Hitler. This is why we're going to do this unit on the Holocaust in class. This is why killing 6 million people matters. In fact, I would argue for my generation and for older generations, and again, probably for many millennials, you probably thought that this understanding of the importance of Nazism and the importance of remembering and even commemorating Nazi history was such a fundamental part of our culture that it was essentially set in stone and that it was never going to change. You would never have to actively, consciously try to explain to someone why Nazi history mattered because, duh, it's so clear. However, in the 21st century, especially after about 2010, and you can date that a little bit one way, a little bit the other way, but the reality is that many foundational elements of the post-World War II order have been challenged. Or if you want to kind of put it diplomatically, they're experiencing a period of heavy reconsideration. They're being rethought. They're being revised. And in some cases, they're being discarded. Now, maybe they should be. Maybe this is the moment to kind of move past the institutions, the frameworks, the ideals and values that defined the post-World War II era. The point of our podcast is not to get into a debate about contemporary politics. That's something for you to decide. What's important to note is that this cultural shift away from the post-45 moment is, one, undeniable, and two, it is something that will affect also the idea that Nazi history matters. Just to, again, flush out these details a little bit more briefly, whereas the post-World War II era was built on notions of free trade and collective security, the 21st century has been dominated by the return of nationalism and the belief in realpolitik. Realpolitik is the idea that you should pursue whatever your political interests are at the moment, form whatever alliances you need to for the time period, and then adjust those over time based on whatever the circumstances are. Realpolitik is the idea that I'm looking out for me and my people, and that's the core basis of our politics. The architects of the post-45 era believed deeply in the power of institutions. They built things like the United Nations, the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. They built all of these structures in the hope that it would prevent radicalism and potentially the rise of a new Hitler. The spirit of the contemporary world, on the other hand, tends to be deeply cynical about the idea of institutions. We would rather either not have those institutions and have more personal liberty, I think is the way that a lot of people think about it, or we would rather place our faith and our power in dynamic individuals who will break things up rather than in large institutions that are full of checks and balances and that drag things out and that, quite frankly, often seem unable to meet the challenges of the time period. I remember when I was in sixth grade, way back in 1990, I saw this video someone produced about climate change, and it was talking about the future and how people would rise to the challenge after a brief period of denying climate change. And they thought that, there was going to be all this action by the UN and all these kind of offsets and things like that. But that didn't happen. Regardless of how you feel about climate change, the idea that let's solve the problem with a big institution, that's not really the way that the spirit of the 21st century feels. We saw this also in Europe, the idea of building these kind of big transnational institutions, the EU, economic integration. But relatively early in the 21st century, people started to say, no, I don't know that I'm ready for that. I want to push back against that. Let's have more of a focus on our national community than this kind of transnational one. Kind of another way to think about this is that culturally, we've fallen in love with the idea of the superhero. We like the idea that sometimes circumstances are so bad that we need men and women of destiny or kind of supernatural abilities or, whatever kind of way you want to phrase it. But this ability to be someone who is a world historical figure who can operate outside or beyond the law in order to solve the problems of the day. We've become kind of enchanted with this. Now, as I said, again, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe this is a necessary thing. Maybe it's time to move on from many of those values from the post-World War II era. But the key point that I'm trying to make here is that as we are living in this era in which the lessons of the 1930s and 40s seem less and less relevant to the average person, what does that do for our perception of the importance of Nazi history? What does that do for our desire to keep alive a memory of this period, and especially to have learned the lessons of what brought Hitler to power, why it kind of went so wrong, and how it all ended in the deaths of tens of millions of people? As much as I hate to say it, the truth is that the importance of remembering Nazism is not immune from the kind of revisionism that we're seeing in some of those other areas that I just talked about. Now, there's a couple of specific examples that we could talk about here, but to me, the most obvious reevaluation of Nazi memory is taking place in Germany itself. And it is highlighted by the growth of the Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD party, which is now the second largest party in Germany. They just captured over 20% in the most recent elections. Now, the AfD is complicated. It often gets tagged as being a kind of far-right party, nationalist party. There's a lot going on politically speaking there. The leader of the far-right party happens to be a lesbian. Her partner is someone that was born in Sri Lanka, and they live in Switzerland. That doesn't seem like your traditional kind of right-wing, far-right-wing neo-Nazi leader. But the key point for us is to note that one of the central tenets or planks of the AfD party is that the time has come for Germans to move past their Nazi past, to stop feeling a sense of shame about what happened so many years ago. Instead, the leaders of the AfD would argue that it's time for a more quote-unquote patriotic approach to history, to celebrate the glorious moments of the German past without getting bogged down in the question of, if we celebrate Germany at the World Cup, is this a precursor to a renewal of neo-Nazism? Are we going right back down the same path as we went with Hitler? Can't we celebrate German achievement? Can't we celebrate German strength? Can't we celebrate German history without it always being about Hitler and Nazism? Now, the most important period of history here that's kind of getting a facelift, if you will, by the AfD is that of Imperial Germany. And this is because in the 1960s, until relatively recently, as historians tried to understand the roots of National Socialism, they associated it very heavily with Imperial Germany. Sometimes they went back a little bit before that. Sometimes they said this has to do with a kind of failed revolution in 1848. Germany did not have a kind of liberal democratic society. Instead, it was kind of ruled over by the Prussians. Prussian king became the German king. We go into detail about all of this in our episode on German unification. But the main point is that people saw Prussian history as militaristic, aggressive, proto-Nazi. And so Germans, after World War II, largely sought to distance themselves from the Germany of the 19th century. They wanted to go back and talk about Heinrich Heine. They wanted to go back and talk about Goethe and Schiller. They wanted to talk about a different democratic tradition within Germany, some of which, of course, is in the 19th century. But the idea of Otto von Bismarck being a huge German hero, the idea of marching along with the Pickelhaube, right, the little pointy helmet, right, all of that got kind of rethought as something that maybe had links to National Socialism. Maybe it was something that we should move away from. If you're looking for a name here to associate with this, one of the most prominent is a guy named Hans Ulrich Wehler. And Wehler talked about this idea of a lack of democratic political culture, and he tied it directly to the idea of Nazism. Now, in a way, it's easy to view this revival of pride in the Imperial German past as the natural, kind of harmless reaction, one could say, to the cosmopolitanism of the late 20th century. Right? I talked a moment ago about the idea of transnationalism and the EU and, where everything is going to be European now. So isn't there a desire, or doesn't that naturally provoke a reaction for people to say, well, actually, wait a minute, I like my German history. I don't want to become European. I want to hang on to my Germanness. And so in some ways, again, the idea of coming back and saying, well, Imperial German history needs to be rehabilitated, that seems very natural and very harmless. In many ways, it is. But we should also note that at other times, it's pretty clear that some of the AfD leadership, people like Björn Höcke, want to rehabilitate at least certain aspects of the Nazi past as well. Höcke, for example, has said that, quote, "The big problem is that one presents Hitler as absolutely evil," end quote. Right, that's the big problem in history. People are too mean to Hitler. Höcke has also criticized the Monument to the Murdered Jews of Europe, which is located in Berlin. It's a very kind of abstract memorial if you've ever seen it. There are lots of criticisms, lots of people that don't like it because it's just basically these kind of stone slabs. It looks kind of like a graveyard in some ways. But Höcke says, hey, this is a monument to shame. Nobody else puts up monuments to the shame, to the awful parts of their history in their capital cities. We put up monuments to the glorious things, to the wars we've won, to the great achievements we've had. Höcke has also called for revoking constitutional prohibitions on using Nazi language. These were implemented after World War II to prevent the resurgence of the Nazi Party. And he also has used the slogan, Alles für Deutschland. Alles für Deutschland, everything for Germany, also happens to be the former motto of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or the Nazi stormtrooper unit. Now, when we talk about language, and especially the idea of, in the United States, political correctness, in Germany, it's actually the law, right? So you can't just go around saying various pro-Nazi things. There is this question when we talk about language of how much are people actually believing in the things that they're talking about? How much does someone like Höcke really, really want to reinvent National Socialism or rehabilitate it? Versus how much of it is just kind of trolling? How much of it is people engaging in behaviors that are taboo, using language that is taboo? If you followed the talk radio circuit in the United States back in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a kind of shock jock host named Michael Savage. I don't know if he's still on today, but he would kind of say the most outlandish things, the most ridiculous things. Alex Jones is another more recent one. Alex Jones says all kinds of amazing, crazy stuff. How much of it does Alex Jones or Michael Savage or whoever, how much do they actually believe? Sometimes it seems more like they are trying to get attention. Sometimes things like Holocaust denial or revisionism, sometimes it's more about the idea of transgressing boundaries. Hey, look at me. The man told you what to think, society told you what to think, but I didn't listen. I talked about the things that I wanted to talk about. I asserted my own power vis-a-vis the broader structures in society. There's also kind of a natural human attraction to the idea of transgressing boundaries. Right? When you were a teenager, did you do everything your parents told you to do? Most of you probably didn't. Most of you probably snuck out at night, or you stayed out late, or your parents said, don't go to this place, don't do this thing, don't smoke cigarettes, don't do drugs, and you did it anyways. And part of it was the rush that you got from doing something that you weren't supposed to be doing, right? From doing something, again, that was taboo. One could argue that in some ways, these people that are involved in historical revisionism, they do it because of the psychology of it as opposed to a true belief in it. They cross boundaries. They go out and they say, I'm going to say the things that no one else will say, not because they really believe it, but because they want the attention from it. Does someone like Höcke really believe in neo-Nazism, or is he just essentially a political troll? Unfortunately, the effect either way is to make the history that we want to discuss in this series of podcast episodes seem less and less consequential, to make it seem less sacred in terms of our duty or our necessity of trying to understand and remember it. Now, speaking of trolls, another example of this type of revisionism can be seen in everyone's favorite billionaire, the quote-unquote world's richest man, Elon Musk. And I say quote-unquote because I feel like every time someone mentions his name in media, they have to call him the world's richest man, Elon Musk. Right? It's almost like he's a wrestler, and that's become his wrestling persona. As some of you know, Elon Musk is a strong supporter of the Alternative für Deutschland. He went in January 2025 to one of their campaign rallies, or at least he appeared virtually there, and he said that there had been, quote, too much of a focus on past guilt, and we need to move beyond that, end quote. The week before he appeared at this AFD conference, he gave this kind of weird salute at Donald Trump's second presidential inauguration. Some people have argued that it was a Nazi salute. Some people have tried to argue it was a Roman salute. Some people have tried to say, no, he was just kind of saying, like, I'm speaking from the heart to all the people over there in that area. Having watched it, I have to say it's hard to say, right? Who knows what's going on in his mind? Who can really say, what a gesture means? But whatever Musk did with that particular gesture, his reaction to the controversy is telling. Instead of saying, look, I just want to make sure everyone understands it wasn't a Nazi salute. I apologize if it offended anybody, something to kind of back down on it. Musk's reaction was to go on social media and start posting things like, don't say Hess to Nazi accusations. Stop Göring your enemies. Bet you did not see that coming. Right, so he made all of these kind of childish puns invoking the language of National Socialism, images of National Socialism, but not with a seriousness, but in a way of saying, hey, look, I'm gonna violate these boundaries. I don't care about your taboos. I'm just gonna make jokes about it. So whether you like him or hate him, it's quite clear that for Musk, the Nazi past has become a joke, not something to be taken seriously or to be learned from. And I'm not saying that, again, he's pro-Hitler or he's a neo-Nazi or something like that. I'm saying that for Musk, the importance of this history doesn't make sense anymore. If you tried to sit down and talk to him about it, you'd get it, oh, come on. Everybody's heard enough about this. Let's move on. And as I'm kind of pointing out in this podcast episode, this has real consequences in terms of forgetting the lessons of National Socialism. And that's something that we're going to unpack and explore in these series of episodes that I'm going to do. Now, I mentioned social media just a second ago. If you happen to spend any time on social media, you can get a strong flavor for the types of antics that I've just described, the irreverence, if you will, towards Nazism and the Holocaust. If you go on YouTube and you look at any Holocaust-related video, there's always just awful things written in the comment section. There's a lot of good comments as well, but there are almost always trolls, almost always people making fun of Anne Frank or things like that. There's a meme that went around of Anne Frank and she's like in an oven and it says like freshly baked or something like that. Right? Just awful, awful stuff. Right? The anonymity of the internet brings out, in some ways, the absolute worst in humanity. Not surprisingly, Holocaust denialism and relativism circulates widely on these platforms. A 2021 report, sponsored by UNESCO, for example, found that almost 50% of the Holocaust-related content on the Russian-dominated Telegram app either denied or distorted the Holocaust. Now, this is 2021, and the numbers were quote-unquote better on Western social media platforms, but it was still 10% of Holocaust-related content on Facebook was about denialism or relativism. On Twitter, it was 15%. And that was before Musk took over and then started kind of reworking the rules in the name of free speech. One of the things that he did was there were a large number of Holocaust deniers that were welcomed back onto the platform, not because Musk was saying, well, we endorse their view, but in the name of free speech, right? We should be having this open discourse, this dialogue with each other. So any opinions are valid and welcome, and we'll just let it all kind of exist. Finally, it's important to note that this pattern of whitewashing the Nazi past is not limited to its Holocaust dimension. There are also groups and individuals dedicated to rewriting the overall history of World War II. In September 2024, for example, former #1 rated cable TV host Tucker Carlson platformed a blogger/podcaster who made these types of sensational claims, asserting, for example, that the Holocaust happened not because Hitler was anti-Semitic, not because of racism, not because of anti-Semitism, but because the Germans just weren't prepared for the number of Soviet POWs that they took. This guy tried to argue on Carlson's podcast that Hitler was really a man of peace. Hitler wanted to sign a peace treaty with Britain after the fall of France in 1940, and it was really only that mean old Winston Churchill that kept the war alive. Winston Churchill was really the warmonger of World War II and really should be blamed for all the people that died. If he had just given Hitler what he wanted, Hitler would have been satisfied and the world would have been fine. Unless you're Jewish, of course, or Roma, or homosexual, or Jehovah's Witness, or Mennonite, or many, many other people, a socialist, a communist. A quick note about this particular podcaster, because he tried to claim that I'm new, I'm fresh, I'm really giving new insights into this. Pat Buchanan, who was Richard Nixon's former speechwriter, essentially made this same argument in the 2000s as well. Anyway, as an actual historian, I have to point out that you can only get to these types of conclusions if you ignore important parts of the history. For example, as we'll talk about, the Nazis believed deeply in a concept called Lebensraum, or living space, that talked about conquering and colonizing the East years in advance of Hitler coming to power, let alone the results of World War II. To get to the arguments that this guy is making, to come to believe in them, you have to ignore the publication of Mein Kampf, where Hitler praised violence and talked about his hatred of Jews and laid out many of his geopolitical plans. You have to ignore the decades of overt racism and anti-Semitism in Nazi propaganda, in Nazi actions, in programs, in marches and slogans and Hitler's speeches. There are literally mountains and mountains of evidence about the intentionality of Nazi killing programs that were presented at Nuremberg. There was this little event in November 1938 called Kristallnacht, a massive pogrom with the burning of synagogues and the widespread arrest of Jews across Germany. Hitler was very clear on his opinion of Jews and his desire to use violence against them. And people like this podcaster are creating alternative historical narratives because it gets them attention. Because again, just like we saw with Elon Musk and some of the social media stuff and Hookah to some extent, what it's really about is, one could argue, breaking barriers, doing things that are taboo in order to show your sense of power, your sense of independence. By the way, another quick aside, if some of you are wondering, why haven't you mentioned this guy's name? You mentioned a bunch of other people's names. The short answer is I don't want to give him the attention. The whole point of saying things that are crazy, again, like Alex Jones, who's already well known, is to get attention. And so it's almost like these school shooters where we've stopped saying their names because the whole point of committing these acts is to get the media to say their names so that they are well known and they get a feeling of attention, a feeling of power. Anyway, you can Google this guy's name if you really want to. But to be clear, even though I'm not mentioning his name here, these people, these types of revisionists that are trying to rethink or re-argue in a very dishonest way the legacy of the Nazi past, they are getting attention. Carlson's show routinely ranks in the top 10 on Apple Podcasts. And Carlson called this guy, quote, maybe the best and most honest popular historian in the United States, end quote. These ideas are gaining traction. They may not be a majority yet, but they are gaining momentum. Our understanding of the Nazi past, of the important lessons that the Nazi period or the Nazi experience has given us, are being forgotten. The consensus that I spoke of at the beginning of this episode about the evils of National Socialism and the need to view it as the antithesis of what a classical liberal democratic society looks like. This is unraveling before our very ears and eyes. And my fear is that we relativize Nazism to the point that we normalize some of its most egregious aspects. So again, before we get into the deep history of the period itself, I want to reiterate why this history is so important. Now, there's obviously a lot of things we could say here. You guys are listening to this podcast about Nazi Germany. You're still tuned in. Clearly, you understand a lot of the political and moral responsibility and questions that Nazism brings to bear. Do we really want to witness or suffer from another Holocaust? Do we want to live under a totalitarian dictatorship? Does anyone out there really want to experience another world war? My guess is that, again, for most of you still listening, the answer to this is a pretty obvious no. You understand that learning about the Nazi experience is important to prevent these things from happening again. Rather than spending a lot of time rehashing all of that in detail, I want to spend just a few moments talking to the people out there who don't think Nazi history is relevant anymore. Whether that's because you've been kind of seduced by these misleading revisionists, you don't think Hitler was that big a deal, or maybe you just feel like it's time to move on, right? The past is the past. Nazi Germany ended, 80 years ago? Aren't there more recent things that we should be focused on? Shouldn't we be focused on things outside of Europe, perhaps? Maybe you're someone or you know someone that just doesn't think history matters anymore. Maybe you're like one of my students who seems to think that there are only 3 majors in college because the only point of a college degree is to make money. And everyone knows that you can only make money if you're a doctor, if you're a business person, or you're majoring in entrepreneurship, or if you're an engineer. So what's the point? Who cares? Why is this history relevant to me? And why should it be relevant to you and the people that you care about? There's a couple reasons for this, the most direct of which is that for all of its imagery of power and material prosperity, the end result of Nazism was not a 1,000-year Reich. Rather, it was Armageddon. Nazism brought Germany millions and millions of deaths. It led to the almost complete destruction of German cities. Millions and millions of people homeless. In some ways, it discredited centuries of German cultural achievement and science. Millions of Germans were also expelled from their homes in places all across Eastern Europe. And the country itself, of course, was then divided by the Allies, and you had further internal migrations of millions of Germans, millions of refugees. Today, we tend to think about refugees coming from poorer places, South America, Central America, the Middle East. Older Germans have a very clear sense of being a refugee tied not to the Middle East, but to Eastern Europe. And again, the millions of Germans that fled west because of what was going on in the East. The end result of Nazism was, again, the country being split in half and Germans losing, or at least experiencing, significant limitations on their ability to control their national destiny for 40 years after it was over. The maybe Hitler wasn't so bad crowd tends to leave this legacy out of the picture. Or as we saw, they blame others for it as if the decision to prepare for war in 1933, or to go to war in 1939, or to enlarge the war in 1941 with the invasion of the USSR, as if all of this was beyond Hitler's control and he had nothing to do with it. The fact of the matter is that Nazism wasn't just bad for everyone else. Nazism, first and foremost, was pretty horrible for Germans. These images of power and prosperity, even if they existed for a couple years, the end result, the legacy, the momentum, the inertia of it was complete and utter destruction. And so in the wake of 1945, Germans in both the East and the West radically began to reject National Socialism and said, we can't ever go down the path. We can't ever make these same mistakes again. Not because of what we did to others, but because of what we ourselves experienced. This brings me to a second critical observation, which extends beyond just Hitler, but describes really most authoritarian movements. These movements are successful because they become effective at generating an allure or an image of being powerful. The leader is a strong, masculine person whose force of will save us from some internal or external threat. We saw this in the episodes that we did on Benito Mussolini. The way that he seemed like a man of world historical destiny. And so as they are taking apart the Italian Republic, most people don't really seem to care because the idea was he will come in and he will fix things. He will make the trains run on time, to use the famous expression. The Nazis were masters of information technology. They sold themselves politically as an antidote to the many negative symptoms of modernity that plagued Germany in the 1920s, be it anger at the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's loss during the Great War, the fallout from inflation and later the Depression, the threat of communism, or even anxiety and loneliness caused by life in the mass society. We talked about this in a separate episode on modernity and urbanization. But what is life like in a big city when there are suddenly millions of people around you? Ironically, it can make you feel very isolated. It can make you feel very powerless. You don't have the ability to control your neighbors, to control the traffic on the street, the pollution, the crime. If you want a great example of a movie to illustrate this kind of anxiety of the age, especially in the big city, go watch Fritz Lang's movie M, which is about a child serial killer who roams the streets of Berlin because of the voices in his head. Nazism, speaking of images, also promoted the idea of health, of well-being, of security, and prosperity. And one of the things that we'll see over the course of the podcast is that it wasn't so much what they said, but especially the way that they portrayed themselves visually, the way that they communicated visually that really won over so many of the masses. We're talking about things like mass demonstrations and parades, understanding that the parade is not about the people marching, it's about the image consumed by the people that are watching the parade. The Nazis made captivating films and artistic exhibitions to highlight the people that they said were enemies, and not just to say, oh, we're against these people, but to frame that opposition in such a way that how could anyone be for degenerate art? The Nazis took the idea of race and made it into something that ordinary people could understand and could try to apply to their daily lives. And again, it wasn't just the idea of how they designed it intellectually or ideologically. A lot of it's about the way that they visualized it in things like textbooks and posters and propaganda. Even the way that Hitler spoke was intentional and powerful, not because of the cleverness of his words as a speaker. Nobody would confuse Adolf Hitler with Abraham Lincoln, for example, or Martin Luther King Jr. But the power of his rhetoric came more so from understanding how one speaks and communicates. Things like the tone of voice, the times of inflection, the pace. Hopefully you find this podcast interesting, in part because of the content, but I try as I deliver it to change the pace, to change inflection, to sometimes make it sort of, again, different as we go along through it, to build up into a place. Hitler was a master of making his speeches not just effective in terms of their content, but in terms of the emotional quality of the deliverance. And we'll talk about this later in the podcast when we talk about the rise of Hitler. The key point here is that the Nazis were successful, one could argue, because they mastered the newly emerging media of communication in a way that their opponents did not. So as we live through revolutions in the ways in which we communicate, not only about politics, but in some ways, more importantly, about things beyond the formal realm of politics. As we talk about all these things, we should probably think about the dissonance between images and the realities, especially as it concerns power. I have a friend that refers to Facebook as Fakebook, right? Because all the images that people are putting up, or many of the images people are putting up, right? It always portrays this like amazing lifestyle. Everything is perfect. I always think about this when I see these stories of families that are traveling and they've got like 6 kids and they just travel around the world all the time and they're always happy and there's no kind of problems whatsoever. That's not reality. That's selectively taking images and presenting a narrative, but it gets into this idea again of using images to generate ideas of power and ideas of what reality looks like. This seems to me to be a fairly important subject in the contemporary world with the revolutions in social media, digitization, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, or X. And of course, one of the key lessons here isn't that it's wrong for them to do it just on a moral basis. What I would focus on is what was the outcome of it? You can create your own virtual reality, but eventually that reality will hit an iceberg called reality. It will run into the walls that really exist. And in the context of National Socialism, what we could say is that strong men are rarely able to control events in the way that media portrays them. This leads me to a third crucial point about morality. In popular culture, we have often understood the importance of Nazism in terms of its relation to the value of human life. We look at the Nazis as social Darwinists, as racists, as anti-Semites, and we note that the Nazis did not regard human life as being inherently valuable. The Nazis committed crimes against humanity in many ways because they didn't recognize the notion of a common humanity. We're talking here about the Holocaust, but also the T4 program to kill the handicapped, the sterilization program, the treatment of prisoners in concentration camps. We can go on with all these different examples, but the point is we tend to view Nazi morality as evil because it led to all these crimes, all these things, these behaviors that we would say are not just inappropriate, but that are criminal, that are sinful, if you want to put it in religious terms. The scary thing, however, is that to carry out all this destruction, the Nazis did not need to reinvent European or Western morality. They did not need to brainwash people or to get them to abandon the churches or what's sometimes referred to as Christian morality. This idea that Hitler just got up there and he was such a great speaker and he brainwashed everyone and they forgot all of their values, that is baloney. That is not what happened. That is a caricature, if you will, of what took place. Instead, the Nazis found ways to work within existing moral codes to get people to accept or justify the idea of murder, of repression, of discrimination. As the American historian of Germany, Claudia Kuntz, once noted, they basically convinced ordinary Germans that, quote, not every being with a human face is human, end quote. And once this disassociation of Jews and other peoples from Germans, of handicapped and healthy, was complete, it was an easy step to violating all of the moral precepts German society was nominally built upon. killing became for many Germans an act of mercy towards their victims. Violence was a form of compassion for your fellow Germans, protecting and in some ways enriching them and enabling them to survive. The taking of life became the gift of life in a kind of twisted moral universe. We could go on and on about this, and of course we will as we move through the series. But the basic point here is that Nazism did not overthrow conventional standards of Christian or German morality. Instead, as I mentioned, it warped them. It used some of our most decent values and desires to bring out the worst in humanity. Again, to quote Kuntz, quote, "The road to Auschwitz was paved with righteousness," end quote. That should make all of us a little uneasy. That should make all of us want to say, gosh, I would like to know more about how the Nazis inverted morality, how they got people to do the things that they said they were most passionately against. That seems to me to be a kind of timeless lesson. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about over the course of this series of episodes. Okay. In the last few minutes here, I want to say just a bit more about what the series will look like, what we're going to specifically cover in these basic episodes. And so we're going to start with the next installment at the end of World War I. We're going to have a discussion of the effect of World War I on the German populace in the early days of the Weimar Republic. This is really the birth years, if you will, of the Nazi movement. It's a time when geopolitical circumstances led many Germans to begin the search for a radical alternative to the constitutional monarchy that had taken them down the path to catastrophe in 1918. We'll talk a little bit about the foundation of the Nazi Party by a guy named Antoine Drexler, and how it was quickly taken over by this upstart who was originally from Austria. Here's your fun fact for the episode. Did you know that Hitler was actually ordered to join the Nazi Party? He started out as kind of like an informant who was supposed to kind of report on their activities, maybe nudge them in a kind of anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist direction, see if the army could really use them. But of course, this changed over the course of time. Now, our third episode will then document the growth of the Nazi Party in the late 1920s. It'll talk about how they overcame a failed rebellion in 1923 known as the Beer Hall Putsch, how Hitler went from being a guy that was a traitor and was in jail to a guy that then led a political renaissance for the Nazi Party after 1929. We'll talk about the Great Depression. We'll talk about the failures of German democracy and see how before the Nazis took over, the structure, if you will, of German democracy had already kind of been destroyed. There were some very key steps taken that Hitler was not even a part of that led to the destruction of democracy that paved the way for its erasure after January 1933. Episode 4 will discuss how Hitler actually came to power, which was not by being elected or voted, as one often hears in public discourse. Hitler was never elected by the German people to be their leader. Rather, he was elevated to the position of chancellor by his former presidential rival, Paul von Hindenburg. And so this leads to one of the great historical what-ifs. What if Hindenburg had chosen a different path? What if he had recognized the danger represented by the Nazi Party? Were there alternatives? Was there a way that we could have not gone down that direction? Later in the series, we'll meet an historian who argued that the Nazi Party in late 1932 was basically bankrupt. That Hitler was basically on the verge of becoming a footnote in history. And that it was only Hindenburg's fateful choice and a little bit of machinations on the part of others, a little bit of Machiavellian kind of behind-the-scenes politicking that placed Hitler into the position where he could wield all that power. Episode 5 will then focus on the mechanics of the Nazi seizure of power, looking at what the process looked like for ordinary Germans. We're going to focus on a small town and see what the Nazi takeover looked like, what it meant for local relationships, how did they overcome some of the local resistances that should have been there. How enthusiastic were Germans about the Nazis taking over? Episode 6 will then get into the machinery of repression. We're going to document how Hitler not only built this kind of totalitarian state, but how they made dictatorship popular. If I said, hey, we're going to build a camp for political prisoners, most people living in a democratic society should say, oh my God, that's terrifying. That's horrible. We shouldn't want that. But the Nazis celebrated it. The Nazis publicized it. Not in a way of intimidating people, but in a way that made Germans say, hey, I'm glad there's a concentration camp at Dachau. I'm glad that we no longer really rely on the rule of law. So how did that happen? We're going to get into that, of course, again in episode 6. Episode 7, we'll look at the flip side of this, which is, again, how the Nazis made dictatorship popular, not through the mechanisms of repression, but through the ways in which they made most non-Jewish Germans' lives better. How they empowered people, how they made them feel like life was getting better. We're going to talk about things like the Autobahn. We're going to talk about the Volkswagen. We're going to see again how Hitler's dictatorship did not rule based on raw intimidation, although there was a little bit of that, but how it became popular, how it inspired people to support it, how they wanted it, how they looked at it as a good thing before the outbreak of World War II. Finally, the last couple episodes will cover things like Nazi racial policy. We'll talk about the Third Reich at war, and then the unfolding of the Holocaust. We'll also have an episode in there about resistance to Nazism, which again, kind of contrary to the popular myth, where people seem to think like, oh, if I said anything bad about Hitler, they would just come and shoot me or throw me in a concentration camp. There were quite a few efforts at resistance, and some of them were actually successful. So that's a lot of ground to cover. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get through there. Might get into the fall, might take a year, who knows. We'll also have, again, those additional episodes that I mentioned that will be available on Patreon that will, again, be about specifically German history. At any rate, to kind of wrap things up, I hope by the end of it all, you have a much better appreciation for the importance of Nazi history. As I've tried to point out today, it is such a fundamental part of understanding why we do the things that we do today, or perhaps better put, why we have been doing them a certain way since 1945. It's a little cliche, so I hope you'll forgive me, but as the philosopher George Santayana once noted, those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So as we move forward into this new age of information and digitization and God knows what's going to happen, as we shape this kind of new future, regardless of what your politics are, I think we would do well to remember the awful legacy of National Socialism, lest we repeat the mistakes of the 1930s. Okay, that's going to be it for now. Thank you as always for listening. I hope you found it useful, or at least intriguing enough to come back for the next episode, again as we start this deep dive into the history of Nazi Germany, its causes, its evolutions, things like that. If you can't wait that long, you can check out our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, for some of the reading recommendations that I mentioned. I'll put Kuntz's book up there. I'll put Wehler's book up there. I'll put some of the other major figures in the field, some classics, some more recent work. But if you can't wait till the next episode comes out, then you can look at this again, Amazon links, reading recommendations, etc. At any rate, we hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.